Harris Atkins. I retired Boeing engineer. I had the good fortune almost 50 years ago of being involved in the Lunar Rover program. It was a really dynamic time in my life as well as a lot of other folks. We were on the verge of putting a man on the moon for the first time. I had been working on the Saturn V program for several years at that point. And we kind of out of the blue decided to bid on a contract to provide a dune buggy type vehicle to the astronauts to help them explore on the moon.
My name is John Winch. I was involved in the design, development, production of the Lunar Rover.
I'm Maine Tonkin. I was the design engineer for the navigation system on the Lunar Rover.
I'm Charlie Martin, and my job on the Lunar Rover was I worked in the area where we did the testing of it. In other words, the men built it, they brought it over to the laboratory, and then we ran it through every test we could to make sure it would do what it's supposed to when it went to the moon.
My name is Dennis McKillop. We had a quality assurance laboratory which we did both chemistry and contamination control. The 1824 Space Environmental Laboratory was where the Lunar Rover vehicle was pretty well tested. We put it in high vacuum chambers, shook it, vibrated it, all kinds of tests. My function as quality assurance was to maintain contamination control, make sure the rooms were clean, because there were limited contamination requirements to make sure we didn't not only contaminate the spacecraft, but the astronauts when they were there or anything like that.
Space program built on a series of successes leading up to that point. Probably the most wow moment was when the first astronaut was put on a Mercury Redstone vehicle and launched in space. Alan Shepard, and then when Glenn came along and went into orbit on an Atlas, which was a vehicle that had a lot of problems. And so there was the wow was the bravery of these people who were willing to do that. By the time it got to the rover, I think we would all had gotten to the point where we figured we could do it. It wasn't a question of whether we could do it, it was a question of we knew we had that capability.
Because it was an exciting program, we were able to pick the best engineers.
It all happened so fast. I mean, we're talking about less than a 2-year period of time in which we went from only the results of research to a vehicle that actually worked. And when you think about that in the perspective of how much time it takes to produce products today in the aerospace or in even in manufacturing, the automobile industry, it's pretty fantastic. In 1969, we began the process of designing and building 4 lunar rovers, plus some test vehicles. The first one ultimately flew in 1971. It was a very fast program. We won the contract in late '69, and by July of 1971, we had delivered the first vehicle.
The preliminary design was done in Kent. You know, at that point in time, the space program was headquartered in Kent.
People don't know how much Kent contributed to the space program.
And we said, well, we're going to do it in Kent. And they says, no, you're going to come down here. And then we finally convinced them. They do not have the kind of technical skills needed to put together electronic system. They had mechanical people, structural people, but they didn't have electronic people. And so when the program was won, of course, we did it in Kent.
It was assembled and tested. They put it through the thermal chambers.
We were in what's called the 1824 Space Environmental Lab, which was torn down several years ago. So it was built, I believe, in about 1965, the Kent facility.
We had a 40 by 50 foot vacuum chamber. And on top of the vacuum chamber, we had a 7-foot solar simulator, which would simulate the sun in outer space. And we put the Lunar Rover in it and ran a complete mission on Earth before we took it to the moon. The simulator that we had Like I say, we could simulate the coldness, the vacuum, the heat from the sun, everything that it would see in space.
We had about, as I remember it, 14 months to design, construct, test, and deliver the rover. And that was the biggest challenge of all.
NASA wanted to take a vehicle on Apollo 15, and because they had been exploring it, but up until that point, the astronauts had been walking around on the moon and were limited by the terrain and the whole situation. So the vehicle allowed them to significantly improve the amount of time they were able to explore on the moon, and so it was really a major step in the exploration of the moon.
We had to fold it up and put it inside a small area in the lunar lander.
The next biggest challenge was the deployment system. The rover was strapped to one of the legs of the lunar landing module, and we didn't know exactly what terrain the module would land on. So it might be tilted back, it might be tilted forward, or to either side.
And we had to fix it so that when they got there, since they have large gloves and what have you, when they got there, they would be able to deploy it and then fold it out and down on the ground, and then they could drive it away.
So what we did was finally go over to just pulling a lanyard down, and it worked like a charm. No problem whatsoever.
Okay, outrigger cables are loose. Roger.
There was a lot of enthusiasm. There was a lot of enthusiasm in all of NASA. To the last minute, there were people who believed it wouldn't work.
I think we were all a little skeptical about our ability to do that, and the time allowed it.
It was a challenge. It was a challenge in just about every regard. There were a lot of people that were convinced that it was going to immediately sink down in lunar dust and never be seen again. There were others who argued that the wheels would get stuck. There were people that argued that the wheels were going to break. Yes, there was a lot that was not known. Of course, we had spacecraft go to the moon unmanned. So it wasn't totally unknown, but it certainly wasn't totally known either. An interesting thing was the straps, to get the lunar rocks, and how are we going to carry them? And they first came up with some elaborate straps to put on it, and it wound up Velcro. Velcro worked like a charm.
Disappointing thing is that when after the program was over, we thought it would be the stepping stone for a greater exploration, and after 50 years, that third lunar rover still holds the record for automobile speed and distance on the moon. So hopefully, I understand that their industry is developing some new hardware that one day may pass that, but right now, Lunar Rover still got the record.
I was part of that. I was fortunate enough to be part of that. I look at the moon, and I have 8 pieces of debris on the moon.
I've always told everyone, you go back to the surface of the moon, bring a new battery, and you can drive off with it. Whether that's true or not, I have no idea. But